This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. He discusses how the recent weather could affect the market and the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates that come out Friday, May 12th at 11 a.m. Sandy Johnson, K-State beef reproductive specialist, continues today's show as she talks about the impact nutrition can have on embryo survival. She reminds producers that nutrition is one of many factors that can contribute to embryo survival. A weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond concludes this week's shows. Chip expects that places that have been getting rain have the best chance of getting more. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in this Friday, and we start our show as we usually do on Friday with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity.
The subject we want to get started on is weather. We've had some weather in Kansas, and how has that impacted the markets?
With weather coming through, we're slowing down planting a little bit, but most farmers in dry areas aren't complaining. You know, we will need moisture for germination for any spring planted crops this year. So I don't doubt we'll be slowed down for a little bit. But when you look at the rain patterns, parts of western Kansas that had been awfully dry have caught some moisture. And I'm sure there are other parts of the state still looking for more to come. But it does help in terms of prospects for successful germination. It gets us started. And of course, we'll need more moisture for non-irrigated crops throughout the state once we get in farther into the summer, June and July, August in particular. Also, ahead of the wheat tour coming up this coming week, it'll probably give what those tour participants will see is greener foliage out in the field. It'll make it, in a way, almost more of a difficult decision. I'm thinking anyway, in that what they see out there will be green, but now they'll have to make their judgment on potential wheat yields this year, more on the basis of wheat stands, of maturity, how likely the crops are to mature given normal weather, as opposed to what happens if they have heat that could hit us. And I think that'll be an issue. I don't doubt that they'll make their judgments, just like the USDA does, based on an assumption of normal weather from here on out, wherever the wheat crop be at. And so I think a lot of wheat has been in the western part of the state, western and parts of central, has been, I wouldn't say zeroed out, but has low yield for crop insurance and may be tore up, may be sprayed out. They may be going on to other crops. I'm not sure. But for wheat that hasn't been, that still has some good potential. This rainfall could help some at the end. We're probably Romulo Lulato in our shop. We talk about this a lot better than I can. Lucas Haig and Jeannie Falk and others. The crop has been under duress for a good while now, and this late moisture will help some. Nobody's complaining about it, but still, you've still a lot of caution about having the perspective of, gosh, well, now we have rain, we'll end up with just a tremendous situation on the wheat crop. And we've got to be able to get enough maturity on that crop before weather turns hot and we start to stress the plant, and to see us closer to 40 bushel as opposed to 30 bushel. So we're kind of battling between 30 and 40 right now as a state average.
And Dan, people, if they stay on, can hear more about the weather when Chip joins us. And next week, we do have plans to hear Romulo Lulato about those wheat tours. But the USDA is going to be putting out a World Agricultural Supply Demand report.
Yes, and as you say, recently they have been leading up to this. April 11th was their last report. Well, here coming today, May the 12th, they'll be putting out numbers. Here we're speaking at about 10 a.m. They'll be coming out about 11. So the anticipation for that report, I think there's two things that stand out to me: that the slowness of U.S. grain exports, literally across corn, across wheat for sure, grain sorghum, and to some degree even a moderation in soybeans will probably be reflected in their supply demand estimates for those crops here in the U.S. I wouldn't be surprised that when you look at ending stocks estimate for U.S. grain, you've got wheat estimated, the average trade guess for this old crop marketing year, 603 million bushels, 602 for the coming year, so not a lot of change. That's up just a little bit from the April report. This will be the first month where the USDA report gives out their projections for the 23-24 marketing year. That starts June 1 for wheat wheat, but September 1 for corn, soybeans, and grain sorghum. And their projections for corn is what really stands out to me in that there's a average trade guess for this old crop market, and you're the one that'll end August 31st, 1.36 billion bushels. Projections using the USDA's yield estimates of 180, 181, 182, something like that. We're projecting over 2 billion bushels ending stock. So in a supply-demand oriented economist, as I am, scarcity tends to bring up higher prices. Well, when you have higher stocks, more supplies around, you tend to have lower prices. So I don't doubt that'll show up. On the soybean side, the average trade estimate for ending stocks for this old crop marketing year that we're in, again, ending August 31st, 212 million bushels. For the next year, they're anticipating bigger crops again, 293, almost 300 million. So I think the story that we'll see coming out of this set of reports out of the USDA is that we'll be ratcheting back old crop usage based on slower exports, very likely, and anticipating sizable crops, normal weather, no problems for next year, and a rebuilding of stocks. I don't doubt that the projected prices first time out will be pretty conservative as well. I think something else to watch, will be the trade estimates for U.S. wheat production, and that'll come here. So we'll have those projections here just a little bit today. Then later on, then next week, the crop tour in Kansas comes through for wheat. So it'll be interesting to see the interplay of those sets of numbers. But for hard red winter wheat, projection of 591 million bushels, some estimates about 100 million, but lower than that. The USDA last year at 531. I think that'll be the, quote, battleground of numbers as we figure out where those are at. Soft red numbers will come out, white wheat as well. Again, we're looking at winter wheat production overall here, not spring wheat yet, and not durum. So we'll see where all that goes in the future.
Continuing to talk about numbers, what do the futures look like?
Well, the futures for we'd seen probably with some of the moisture that has come, corn, and as we are talking here about midday on coming into the reports, we're looking at corn futures generally down 5 or 6 cents from July on down the road. We're looking at D's corn about 5.15 and a half. Soybeans for November, again, new crop about 12.50 up front, about 14.11. So, and for both of these, you're looking at for corn a drop from July to December of about an estimate of about 60 cents on the corn market, an estimate about $1.60 or so for soybeans. So quite the drop. Even I think with the moisture that's come and in anticipation, a little better wheat production prospects, wheat markets moving about 9-10 cents lower. July, they've been trading about 8.45, 8.50 thereabouts. I really am curious to see coming out of these the numbers in a little bit today where the markets will go. I wouldn't be surprised. I guess it's the cautious economist in me that when we see hard numbers that'll come out, that'll tend to be anticipating normal weather, et cetera, that I would hope that they wouldn't be taken as a final set of numbers, that we don't have any worry about where the crops will go in for the next several months. I just wouldn't be surprised that if we get large numbers estimated for next year, that it would tend to have a downward effect on the markets. But it depends if you're a buyer or seller, if that's good news. From a Kansas farmer perspective, they'd always hope for higher prices in most cases. But again, it's early in the crop reporting, in the growing season, and in the set of these crop reports. And I guess we'll just have to see where the trend goes in the coming 30, 60, 90, 120 days.
And Dan, as we round out on your knowledge, could you touch on the markets of feeding grains, wheat, and sorghum?
I think that feed grains overall, I'm watching closely to see how we finish out the rest of this summer. We were so scarce on supplies last fall, and people had bought a lot of grain, bought ahead to fulfill what their needs were. And now here in western Kansas, we do have another crop coming, but it's not going to show up until, at least for the feed grains for corn and sorghum, until we get out into fall. So I'm really wondering on the feed grain markets how basis levels and when the western corn belt will respond if we'll tighten up, just because people being tight with supplies. On the soybean side, with the major crop coming in South America out of Brazil, basically, that's on the export side, that's worked against us competitively. So I think we've seen some ups and downs of late on soybean basis. So in essence, with issues on the river markets and or the challenges of soybeans in South America coming to market with their large shipments and other issues at hand, we've seen some variation in local basis in the state. So I guess I'm kind of waffling around to say I don't know exactly where the soybean market's going to go, just because of all this uncertainty. As long as that soybean crop in Brazil is strong, competing hard against the U.S., that tend to be a downer for our markets. The flooding that's happening in the Mississippi River system kind of taken away some of our competition, however, or limited that. So I guess what's really interesting to watch is how soybeans in central Kansas, southeast Kansas, in light of the flooding that has been happening in that river system, if we see an uptick in our basis to try to compensate for that for whatever exports we do have. And for that, as we talked about, we're watching wheat development, and that'll tell a lot as to where Kansas markets go. And if we end up with a short crop, we'll still have pretty high wheat prices. But I think we've just struggled for a good while now because of slow exports, and it's hard to see that shifting around with our current, some of our national financial policy moves. That I'm not arguing that they're not needed, but the high value of the dollar has hurt our ability to export crops, and that's especially the case for wheat.
And if producers or listeners would like to see this report or the USDA World Agricultural Supply Demand Report, where could they do so?
For the USDA report, I think the USDA Office of the Chief Economist is where you can directly get online. You search for that, then look for commodity markets, and then they put out that WASDE report. That's the first place to go. And we try to follow up on that quickly from our Ag Manager website, www.agmanager.info. And with that, we'll put out the reports that I work off of, and can certainly help anybody that needs to track down the upcoming WASDE reports as they're let out as well.
Dan, thank you so much for giving us our weekly grain update.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. The report that he was talking about from the USDA is coming out this Friday at 11 a.m., which you can find on the USDA website. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Now we're going to talk about an article that recently went out on the Beef Tips newsletter here at K-State, The Influence of Short-Term Nutritional Changes of Embryo Survival. And in to talk about it is K-State Beef Reproductive Specialist, Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
You bet. I always enjoy doing these programs.
Sandy, to get us started, could you talk a little bit about the fertility and kind of what started you looking into this?
We've always known that embryonic loss was very high early in the process. So if we looked at fertilization that occurred shortly after mating, the fertilization rate is typically very high, 95, 98%. And that holds true for most of our farm animal species. But if we look later at embryos, or now that we have the ability to do an ultrasound at 30 days, we can see that we have a lot of loss there. And we might have 70% of those still pregnant at 30 days. So we've lost about 25% from, that initial fertilization rate to 30 days. And we tend to lose some over the course of the pregnancy. And, as producers, we don't want to lose any pregnancies, but we should recognize that maybe it's good that those pregnancies didn't come to term, because they probably had some developmental issues. And as many times as things go right in the process, occasionally it goes wrong. And so we do have some of these losses. Now, so there's what we might consider quote unquote normal losses. And then there may be some other things that we can help reduce those losses.
So the article is titled Short-Term Nutritional Changes. It has in the title of it. So what nutritional changes are you thinking about, and how does that affect embryo survival?
We can look at a number of things that might impact our fertility rate or embryo survival. And, those things might include disease. You might expect nutrition is what our focus is, but also we can see some effects of temperament, temperature changes, or other stresses, say from movement, all of those things could impact embryonic loss. But nutrition is one I wanted to focus on because as we look at our situation now, we're doing a lot of things with our feeding programs that are a little bit different. And so as we adapt to drought, then we need to think about how those might impact cows early in gestation. If we focus on nutrition, there are a number of metabolic hormones that regulate lots of things about animal homeostasis and how hungry animals are and how we use those nutrients, but they also impact the embryo. And one example we can give is if we restrict an animal's intake, we can see a change in insulin in a relatively short period of time. And I'm talking a pretty severe change in nutrient intake. And so we can see then if we experimentally try to replace that insulin in an embryo in a dish, that we can get relatively normal development compared to an embryo that faced insulin deficiency, lack of feedstuffs. So we've shown we can take it away, we delay development, we put some insulin back, development goes back to normal. So we see some immediate effects of what we associate insulin with what happens after we eat. It goes up, So the nutrition and reproduction, now we're talking about a very cellular level. And so if those changes occur when that embryo is at a critical time, then those embryos can be impacted. And so there are a number of metabolic hormones that are involved. And by using insulin as an example, I'm oversimplifying. But we do know these things to happen. And it doesn't kill all the embryos. Some of them are more able to maybe adjust in some manner. But we do reduce some embryo viability by these changes in nutrition.
So, Sandy, a thing to point out here is nutrition isn't the answer to embryo survival, but it's just information that you want to share with producers.
Right. We want to keep in mind that as we're thinking about these cows early in the breeding season, trying to establish these pregnancies, we have other examples. I was talking about studies and in vitro studies of looking at embryos, but we can look at studies using the whole animal and changes in nutrition. And again, if we restrict nutrient intake certain times, particularly early in gestation, we can reduce embryo survival. An excellent example of this is a study where they looked at nutrition immediately prior to AI and immediately after AI. And what they did was change the pasture allowance. So those with a high nutrient allowance had about twice as much forage allotted as might be expected for the number of animals in a time period. And then the other group had about 80% of what they thought they should have. So they were restricted by being stocked heavier as opposed to situations where we're reducing the amount of feed in front of them, right? So they looked at changing nutrition, either this high or low before breeding or the high or low after breeding. And the bottom line was those animals that went from high to low after breeding, so high allocation of nutrients prior to breeding and low after, had poorer embryo survival. And you might think those that were low before and low after would have poor embryo survival, but they were similar to the other groups, and probably that's because they had kind of adapted to whatever that intake was. So it's some of these rapid changes at just the right time that might impact our embryo survival. So we just want to remind producers to be aware of, some of these short-term changes at key times can impact embryo survival. And as we're forced into management situations to deal with feed availability, we probably can't eliminate all of these, but we need to understand that they can have an impact and try to minimize those impacts. And, our ideal world if we had to move or change nutrition, if we could get those pregnancies to 45 days when implantation occurs and beyond, that would be the ideal world. We don't live in the ideal world. We try to minimize those stressors, but just recognize those embryos are really sensitive to those changes early during gestation, and we should do what we can to minimize that, to have the highest survival of embryos and higher pregnancy rates at the end of the breeding season.
Sandy, you brought up an ideal world, and I feel like in an ideal world we'd have green, luscious grass everywhere. So since we're in an unfortunate drought here and just limited forage availability probably moving forward, something just for producers to keep in mind.
Right. We want to, do the best if we can keep them on even if it's not optimal, something consistent amount over time is better than wide swings during this early embryonic development.
What key message would you like producers to take away from information you're sharing?
We know that we're making a lot of tough decisions this year, how we're managing cows, where we have feed, will we get some moisture on this pasture, should we go out there? This to me says there may be times when we think about a little more supplementation early in pregnancy if we can. If there's any question about how much forage is out there and if there's enough. Particularly, we're coming out of a dry lot setting where we're really meeting all their needs, and we're turning out to pastures that may be a little behind, and maybe our breeding season's still a couple weeks off, okay? That maybe the grass will catch up by then, but understand that having enough nutrition there is important for those embryos, and obviously, we normally talk about having enough nutrition just to get the cow cycling. That's important as well. But once she's cycling and we got an opportunity to breed her, we certainly want to get as many of those early pregnancies as we can. So it's a balancing act, but recognize that the opportunity to influence embryonic survival early in gestation and manage that as best you can.
Sandy, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some information with our producers. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
That was K-State beef reproductive specialist Sandy Johnson. If you would like to read her article that we reference in today's show, it is titled Influence of Short-Term Nutritional Changes of Embryo Survival, and you can find it by going to ksubeef.org and clicking on the Beef Tips newsletter. We will also link it in today's show notes, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. And if you are reaching your destination right now and don't want to miss out on the rest of today's show, you can find the rest of it on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and as always, we end this week's programming with our weather update, and in to do it is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, taking a look back at what's happened in this past week, we've had that warmer weather that you alluded to last time we talked.
Yeah, we were very warm over the weekend. We saw temperatures in the 90s and even some upper 90s. I saw 98 around Topeka, and that most of the heat was restricted to central and eastern Kansas, just with cooler air working into northwest Kansas. But, it's not abnormal to have 90 degrees in May. I was just pulling up some numbers for central Kansas, and our average first 90-degree day is, for those who didn't get it already, it's early May for the most part, and so we were right smack on average when we expect it. And when we look at heat-wise, got to think back to last year at this time where we strung together about 5-6 days of 90-plus degree weather. So it's not atypical for this time of year. It was just a big shock to a lot of people and animals, especially, that we're accustomed to cooler weather, especially with the recent moisture we had the week or two prior.
Last time you also referred to popcorn weather that we might have across the state.
We definitely had scattered storms throughout the state, and they were focused in specific areas. Some areas got hit more than once, other areas not so much. Moisture with these storms was upwards of 3 inches. I know northwest Kansas measured 3 inches here in the last 48 hours or so, and then our areas of northeast Kansas and east central Kansas also had about 2 inches of rain in the isolated areas, but other areas missed completely and did not see moisture. And some of those locations are pretty darn close to each other. And so we are not seeing these widespread rains. It makes drought a little bit harder to assess, and it's kind of typical as we get into the warm season with more convective nature, the isolated nature of moisture. And then, hope is that we can get enough thunderstorm activity that would at least give everybody something. And hopefully most people have received some moisture, and it will help the drought conditions as we go into the following week. The new drought monitor came out yesterday, and keep in mind that included precipitation up until Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. So most of that thunderstorm activity that happened Tuesday and Wednesday and into Thursday, all is going to be reflected on next week's drought monitor. Some areas will likely see improvement, I imagine, after the amount of rain that we've gotten, and hopefully we can keep the tap going and the moisture going. Unfortunately, it's probably too late for a lot of the wheat. The wheat tour is getting ready to kick off, and just by driving the state in the last week, some really, really short wheat that is already heading out and likely past the stage of where rain will be beneficial.
And looking ahead to next week, what are we going to see in Kansas?
It's a very interesting setup. We've got a stagnant weather pattern that's setting up across North America. It's going to bring more heat to the Canadians, unfortunately. But it's going to produce a stagnant, stalled-out, low-pressure system in the New Mexico region. What that's going to do is bring some waves of moisture northward, but likely going to stop at southern Kansas or just along the Oklahoma border. It appears to be the area most favored for round after round of moisture. We're talking maybe 4 or 5 rounds late weekend into early next week. And since these systems are stalled out, we're going to be very consistent where whoever gets rain is going to keep getting rain, and whoever doesn't get rain will likely stay dry for much of next week with warmer temperatures. So the rainfall will be less sporadic in that southern region. It's just, unfortunately, we're not going to share it with a lot of central and northern Kansas.
And Chip, for a lot of people, this weekend is graduation. Do people need to expect to have just heat, or is there a chance of rain for some places?
When I think about graduation, I always think about severe weather, and the Joplin tornado, for instance, is a big event that happened during graduation weekend. Thankfully, no real high-impact weather is expected. We expect a few scattered severe storms in northeast Kansas Friday, and then as we get into the weekend, I expect fairly quiet weather. Like I mentioned, the southern Kansas border might get occasional showers, but overall, a fairly dry look to the weekend.
Chip, as always, thank you for giving us a weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That is all for this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you on Monday.